So let's discuss where the data comes from related to a time card and also the project lists that are available on the time card. The data sources on a time card, I've included this slide and a couple others so that you can refer back to them, but there's some key components on a time card, specifically who the approver is. So this is that document level approver we've been talking about. The project list, where does that come from? And then also we have a week ending date. The approver we've already looked at when we set up the employee. It's in the employee and resource maintenance screen. And it's either the supervisor or the manager field. That's a setup, we can choose which one it is. For the project list, we can, the list will be related to either the project employee maintenance screen or from the resource assignment. So we'll discuss that. And then week maintenance, the week ending date is available in the week maintenance screen. And we'll come back and we'll show all the screens for these as well. Each time card has a labor class. When you think about how a time card is processed, we want to make sure that the cost is associated to the activity that the employee is doing. So the activity generally drives key information related to the billing. So quite frequently the billing rate is based off of the activity that the employee did. So if I'm functioning as a project manager, we probably will bill at a different rate than I would if I'm functioning as a data reviewer or something like that. So we can define different billing rates based on the labor class. We can also do it by the project or the task as well, but labor class is one of those common things. That's also something that usually is needed on the invoice when you send it to your customer. A lot of times they want to know what function that employee is acting in. So the labor class is very critical. So that's one of the key components. We can change, the labor class can be changed by the employee during data entry if you want, but quite frequently we define that for the employee and we default that onto the time card. The GL account is also based on a hierarchy, and we'll show you the screens for this, but basically the hierarchy depends on the project. So if you think about a project, sometimes we set up overhead projects. An overhead project would be something that you would want to charge to a GL account that's probably different than you would a direct labor account. So we typically, when we set up projects, we'll set up an overhead project, we'll set up admin projects, such as vacation, or time off projects as well, vacation, jury duty, those type of things. So depending on the kind of project, that might drive the type of cost we want to see in GL. So if it's just a regular billable job, I want that to posting to direct labor. If it's an overhead job, I typically would want to have that post to an overhead cost account. So the project is a key field that we want to be able to identify the labor account to. So if we set up a project, we can link a labor account to that project or even the task on the project. But in the absence of having a specific labor account on the project, sometimes we want to go to the type of function that I'm doing. So based on the work the employee is doing, that might be the GL account we want to track to. That's less frequent, but that is a possibility. So if we come back and look at the hierarchy here, we'll see that first of all, we look at the labor account on the task. That means if there's doing a certain activity, maybe that account needs to be posted to a specific GL account. Then if there's not anything on the task, we'll look at the project. And if the project has an account, such as the example of if it's a PTO job, we would want that to go to some type of a PTO account rather than our direct labor. So we would associate a labor account to the project in that instance. In the instance that there's not a GL account on the project or the task that we've associated to, then we look just simply at the labor class of of what is being charged to, and that's the GL account we'll use. I'll show you in the screens on how all that's set up. The sub-account is based off of, here's our sub-account field, and that can be based off of either the project or the task or the employee. And we define that in time and expense setup. So this time and expense setup screen determines how that defaults. So let's go look at the time entry screen, and let's just walk through and see how a time card defaults when we choose an employee. So I'm going to choose my Andrew Clark employee. Notice my week maintenance screen. I get an error if I tab through it and it says that the week maintenance, there's not a valid week ending date for the date that's entered on this time card. So this field here pulls from week maintenance. So we set up all the weeks that we plan to charge time for, and we also can set up the fiscal periods and the labor accounts that go with the labor periods that this would post to. So that's where the week maintenance comes from. So I'm going to pick an earlier so I've chosen a different week ending date, and it liked that week ending date. Now when I come to the bottom or the grid area, I'm going to choose the project. And how is the project list is determined based off of some key fields. So if I F3 here, all these projects are based off of setups. So we're going to kind of drill back into how we determine those setups. So the simplest and most open form of choosing a project is to allow anybody to enter to that project. So if I come to this project, and you'll see that this checkbox in the middle of this project says available for all employees to charge. And because that box is checked, any employee that goes to enter a time card in their web apps or even in Dynamics, this project will show in their list. So that's the easiest or straightforward, but not always the happy path per se. So if we uncheck this box here, we're saying we're not wanting everyone to charge to this job. We want to be able to assign who charges to this job. So when we uncheck this box, that means that we need to assign the employees we want to be able to charge to this project. So we're going to go to Project, Employee Maintenance, and we would choose the job number. And here we would list who are the employees that can charge to that job. So when we've assigned, we would uncheck the available all employees, and we would assign who's available to charge to this job. Now, in this scenario, when we've chosen this scenario, that means they can charge to any task on the job. The main gatekeeper is just the project ID, and if we get past that gatekeeper of the project ID, then the tasks are free reign. But sometimes we want to instead restrict the tasks they can charge to as well. So in that scenario, we would keep this box unchecked like we just showed you. But instead we would say, well, we want to assign resources to charge to tasks. So when this box is checked, then we have to go to the next level where we define what tasks they can charge to. So that's under resource assignment. When we assign resources, there's a couple things we want to be aware of. We want to realize that there's certain tasks they can charge to. We would like to be able to limit the dates that they can charge them, but Dynamics only allows you to assign them to a task. Once they're assigned to that task, regardless of when the dates are, they can charge to it. The other key thing is sometimes we have the concept of subtasks. So we have additional, like, lower level tasks that we want to charge to, but we don't really want to track or charge to those tasks in Dynamics and track amounts to them, but we want to be able to designate that it was for this type of subtask. So within the resource assignment screen, we have the ability to go to that extra level on the task. So I'm going to choose a task, and let's say it's administrative tasks. And I'm choosing the resource that I want to be able to charge to this task. And here I can put a subtask in. So an example of when we would use a subtask, maybe we're doing document review and we want to designate a certain document. So we want to say the intro document is the subtask, and maybe we'll have another one where it's the content of the document. So we could create a separate subtask for all of those different levels. By just typing this subtask in here, this gives that employee the ability to choose this project, this task, and this subtask during entry of their time card. We can enter a start and end date. It does not prevent you from entering past that date, but it is available so that you get a feel for the time frame that employee will be on a job. And then we can enter the number of hours that we anticipate that they're going to work on this project. So let's say they're going to do 50 hours. And if they're set up as hourly, then you'll also get an estimated cost here as well. this is available then if you've assigned them to a resource at the time they're entering their time card. Then it will allow them to show the time cards that they've been assigned to. So if we've been scheduled on certain tasks, at the time the time card is entered, we could load the scheduled task and it would show the list of tasks that they've been assigned to for that reporting period. If we have this box checked here, then the only instance that somebody can report to our project is if they've been assigned at the task level. If they have not, then that project will not be available in their list. There's one other, I'm going to change this back to available for all employees to charge. There's one other way that we can restrict the listing of employees on time card. One is to make the project inactive. If the project is inactive or in plan stage, then they will not be able to see that project to charge to. But let's say our project's getting close to the end and we still need to do some billing and things like that. So we need to make the project, keep the project active, but we really don't want new labor to be posted to it. So we can come into the project here and we can uncheck the labor box, and then that will prevent any labor from being charged to that job. We can still enter transactions in AP, AR, and GL, but we would not be able to associate labor to that job. And all that occurs, all these restrictions result in, if it's been done, is it's all in the when they hit F3 or the possible value list. So this list is driven based off the features we just reviewed. So let's recap a couple of the things we just reviewed. So we can look at the project list here. So all available for all employees to charge. That is one option. That is the most freeform and open choice related to time entry. Then we can restrict, uncheck that box, and then when that box is unchecked, then the setup screen required is the project employee maintenance screen. So you can see that relationship here in this screenshot. And then if we've checked the resource assignment required to charge tasks, then the setup screen required is then the resource assignment screen. Now we want to talk about some other setup options, specifically the labor class, the week maintenance, also how to set up records for the employee position rate maintenance, how a labor employee cost codes labor costs are determined for an employee, and just also review the resource assignment screen. So this is a labor class, and I mentioned before that the reason we use labor classes is to help us for billing purposes, also to help us understand what the employee was doing on a specific project. We also, as I mentioned before, can associate them to a specific GL account, so that can drive labor costing to a specific account in the general ledger. So if we look at this code file maintenance screen, you'll see that there are labor classes defined, and then there are GL accounts also associated with them. We've seen this screen before. I don't know if you recall, but when we set up our validation for our project in a previous session, we could see that it used the code file to define those possible value lists. So this is an example of a system-defined code file that we also need to edit and maintain. So let's go to here and let's go look at a code file. So code file maintenance, it's a great opportunity to recap this screen here. So code file maintenance has, at the beginning, you'll see in my list, I have a lot of code files that start with 0. And my recommendation is if you create your own code files that you would want to start them with 0, because there are other code files that the system uses, all the non-zero code files, and these are system-wide ones that are predefined by the development staff. However, if you start, they will never create a code file that starts with a 0. So you can have confidence if you create your own code file, if you use 0, that it will never conflict with something that the development team puts together or creates. So let's look at the labor class. So it's LABC is the code file type. and we come over here and we can add our own code files. Now you notice I only have one account that has a specific GL account. If you're going to use GL accounts on your labor classes, you would want to populate all of them. But we're restricted to a 4-digit code or file ID, so it cannot be longer than 4 digits, because that's the screens throughout the system use the 4-digit. But this description is freeform, and you can choose whatever you want. These can be numeric or alpha as well. So the code file ID of ADMN actually could be a numeric value or a letter value or a combination of the two. So when I'm entering my time card, go back to my time card. I thought I had it open. Yep. Nope. Time card entry. Do time card with rate and amount. Choose my proper week ending date. I'm going to use 98. Okay. So the labor class that's available in this list, I'm choosing the project and the task, and we've already defined how I can get this list available. The subtask we talked about, I could type in the value if I've been assigned to a subtask. And then this labor class will default from my employee, but this list here is based off of the code file. So if you need a new labor class, and just like we talked about before, if you hit F3 or the possible value and you get a list and you don't know where you're supposed to edit it or maintain it, if it's based on a code file, it will always give you the code file ID here. So that's user-friendly in the fact that, oh, yes, I need a new labor class. Where do I go add it? Oh, I go to code file, LABC, and then we can come over here and edit and maintain those by pulling up LABC here, okay? The next screen we're going to talk about is week maintenance. If you have week maintenance, you will always have to have some week maintenance screen set up because it needs to know what the week ending date is. And the importance of the week ending date is so that when you post your time card, it knows how to associate a date to each day of the week within that week. So if I have a week ending date of the 20th, and that's a Friday, then any time entered on the Friday of that week would have the 20th day of the month. And then so any time I put on Thursday would have the 19th day and so forth. So it's very critical when you post your time cards, it will identify the proper dates for each time card line item. We typically suggest a week ending date of weekly, so a weekly ending, a week time frame to enter your time cards and submit them. Dynamics is flexible and it will allow longer and shorter time periods. So if you wanted to enter them daily and post them daily, you could. Just realizing if you had time card corrections, you would have to correct each day if that's the method you used. So let's look at the week maintenance screen because there's some very, very key information within this screen. One is the week ending date, which I mentioned. The second one is the labor period. And this would be the period that it's going to post to when it goes over to general ledger. So when you run the GL labor posting, this is the period it posts to. I also have a time card period, and this is just related to a display on the status screen. So when we get to that screen, we'll reference back to this screen so it makes sense. And then the fiscal period, actually this is the labor posting period. The fiscal period is the period in GL that it will post to. The labor period is the period it displays in Timecard Status. So the week ending date is the date that you choose the time card to enter for. The labor period and the time card period are what control the viewing in Timecard Status screen. Then the fiscal period is what controls the GL posting. I don't want any confusion about that. And then the third field is called the salary factor. And if you have a salary employee, then we could end up having short weeks, depending on the day of the week. So let's go and look at this. Let's get a better feel for this screen by going into Dynamics and looking at the screen here. So I have some older dates in here, but let's say we're entering, this is an example of a week cutoff, a short period. So typically here we have, the weeks are 7 days. So we have July 15th through July 22nd. That's a 7-day period. Then July 29th as well. But then we want the costs that for the period ending July 31st to all go to the same period. We don't want those costs, those time cards that have July transaction dates to post in August. So what we do is we create a short week that ends the last day of the month. So there's two days of the week that end in that will be posted to July. So we do not want 100% of our salary going to July. So the salary factor allows you to say one of 5 days is going to post to the 1/5 of my, or excuse me, 1/5 of my time is going to be posted to this week ending date of July 31st, and then 4/5 of it's going to be posted to August 5th. So my salary will be appropriately split between these 2 week ending dates. So that's going to help give me my cost into the right reporting period in general ledger. If you don't have salary employees, the salary factor is meaningless, but for salary employees, it's very important. Back to my entry here. So how do we get this labor class to default to SUPR? Where does that come from? So let's look at the employee position rate maintenance screen. And the employee position rate maintenance screen allows me to set up defaults for the employee. So I'm going to choose employee. You'll see that I have an NA line for the project. This is NA just means it's the default line. So I have a default line and I can have effective dates, so I can have a rate change. So on March 2nd, their effective rate was $15 an hour. But then on January of the next year, my default effective rate is now $19.70 an hour. So it allows us to keep a history of their pay changes. This person happens to be salary, so it's going to use the salary rate when it calculates the pay and the cost on their time card. This SUPR then becomes the default. So if they enter a time card anytime after 1/1, it will use the default labor class as SUPR. And we did see that when we created this time card, SUPR is what defaulted onto their time card. Now let's look at a different employee. I have Andrew, and he's set up a little differently. So I have an NA line here as well, and this is the default. And so anytime that I enter a time card that's 1/1/98 and newer, it will use Architect as my default labor class. I'm an hourly employee, and my rate is $20 an hour. But we start this project on January of the following year, and I'm not functioning as an architect for this job. I'm functioning as a consultant. So if I enter a time card for a job other than CO 123001, I want my labor class to be architect. But if I'm entering time on this job, I want my time to show as a consultant. So let's go enter a time card for Andrew, and we should see that this happens. So if I come here, I'm going to do new. I don't want to save my changes. And I'm going to choose Andrew. And then I'm going to choose when I choose, I'm going to put it in form view. So form view just allows us to see the entire document at a time. So here's my project. So if I choose projects CO99, you'll notice that my labor class shows architect. But if I would choose CO123, hang on a second. Oh, I chose the wrong one. CO123001. With that project, the default labor class becomes consulting. So this will allow you to have more than one labor class if that employee functions as in a different format for each one. Okay, so let's go back to our PowerPoint. So just to recap this screen, we have to have at least one NA line, one default line. If you don't have a default line, when the employee tries to enter their web app, or their time in a web app, they'll get a message that there's not a labor class defined. If you set up a separate project, then that project will override the labor class for your default. We can also use this screen for labor costing too. So if they're an hourly employee and you have a different labor class for a specific project, then you could also define a cost here that's different than the NA line. It doesn't happen very often because most of the time the billing rate is the thing that we need to be different, but the employee gets paid the same cost regardless of the project they work on. However, if you do have an instance where they get paid a different cost rate for a specific project, this screen could be used for that. So let's look at that. So if you see the first line here, the NA line, his cost is $75 an hour for all the projects that he charges to. But when they charge to CO003, then the rate they get, the cost rate is $70 instead of $75. Again, this will only work on hourly employees, not salary employees. This is a great time to talk through some labor costing. The best way to describe labor costing is we have three different kinds of labor costs. We have hourly, which is basically straightforward. Every hour they charge to a project, they will get an hourly rate costed to that job. If they work overtime, then you can have an overtime factor, and that factor would be applied to their hourly rate. We can have an overtime like time and a half. We can also have a double time if you have that. So there's two overtime factors that can be defined. We also have salary employees as well. A salary employee is a little different in that most of the time we just want to take their salary divided by their hours, and that's what we charge. So the salary is more of an effective rate. So if you think about an employee who makes $1,000 a week and they work 40 hours, then their effective rate per hour would be $25 an hour, 1,000 divided by the 40. So every project they charge to would be costed at the $25 per hour. However, if they charge $50 or 50 hours on that same 1,000, they would have an effective cost rate of $25 an hour, or $20 an hour, excuse me. So every project they charge to, the 1,000 would be divided into 50, it would be a $20 an hour rate for each hour that's charged. And we also have a situation where we have salary non-exempt, and that they are eligible for overtime as well as just their standard salary. So we would have a situation where they possibly have their standard $1,000 salary, but they also worked overtime. So we would charge maybe 10 hours in overtime, and you could have the 10 hour, we get paid their $1,000 plus the 10 hours overtime with their standard rate of $25 an hour. So they would get $1,250 for that time card if they associated their time to overtime. So this slide is a recap of that. So salary exempt has no overtime calculation at all. If they've been set up as salary exempt, there will not be an overtime calculation, and it just dilutes any hours over 40. If they're salary non-exempt, they will be paid their standard salary, and if they enter any time into the overtime field, that will get paid at their standard rate. And then we have the standard hourly employee, where we have all the regular units are multiplied by the regular rate, and then we have overtime 1 and 2 available as well. And we do have the ability to identify different costs by the project ID, and there's also flexible rates where we can add more complex calculations to their hourly rate, but we don't have time to cover that in detail during this course. So in context of that, let's look back at the employee resource and maintenance screen, and let's get an idea of how we can add those different components that we just talked about. So we have a pay type the pay type field controls this. So if they're hourly, we use HR. If they're salary exempt, we use S1, meaning regardless if any overtime is entered, it's not calculated. And salary non-exempt, which is S2. Now, we control the costing of that at the time the time card is entered. There are two check boxes here. And if you remember on the web app, when I showed the web app, they had overtime 1 and overtime 2 buckets per day as well. So if I check at the time that I'm entering this, I will have Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and so forth. If I check the overtime 1 box, then you'll see I have Monday. This is the regular bucket, and this is overtime 1. It's a little easier to see in form view. So now I have a bucket per day for regular and a bucket per day for overtime 1. And if I check the overtime 2 box, I get a bucket per day for overtime 2. So if they're hourly, their standard rate will be applied to anything in regular. Their overtime 1 rate will be applied to this, and overtime 2 rate will be applied to that. So salary employees, if they enter time into the overtime, depending if they're exempt or non-exempt, their time will be handled according to the previous slide we just discussed. Resource assignment, we've already discussed this screen. This is just a reminder of how you can assign resources and how you can associate them to subtasks. We have alternative timesheet or entry screens related to timesheets, specifically the timesheet screen. I have project timesheet entry, and I have project timesheet with rate and amount. Same concept as what we discussed before. We have the same screen. The only difference is one includes the rate, and the other one does not. This screen can be used if you have, let's say you have a foreman who's on a job and you have construction employees and they don't fill out their time cards. You don't want them submitting a time card, but yet you need to track it in the system and you need to generate costs on the job for purposes of billing it. So instead of having each employee do their own timesheet, we want to have them provide their information, but somebody's going to enter their timesheet on their behalf. So we can come into Dynamics after the fact. We take their timesheets they provided, and then we enter them for them. So we typically have a preparer, and then we can choose the document item we identified. The key to this is it's very similar to what we see in the other screens in the fact that we have a project and a task. But the main difference is that we can associate, I have to have a valid week ending a date again, so it always reminds me if my week ending date is not valid. And I can choose a project and a task. But then the great part about this is that I can associate it to a specific employee. So I can enter multiple line items for that employee. So I can have this line item for this employee, and then I can have, let's say, we can enter a start and end time, or I can just put the number of hours for that day. Then I can do a whole completely separate line for that same employee or a different employee for the next day. And so it's a really easy way. This screen's easy to copy and paste to and from Excel if you want it, if they're collected in that way. But basically, you can just have a list of all the employees and their time on a per day basis. This actually can feed and create a time card for each employee as well. So once the timesheet's finished, we save it as in process. It doesn't like I need my project. But when we save it, this Create Time Card button will become enabled on the bottom right here, and it will actually generate time cards for every employee that's in this list. So if you think about it, you could import every day the time from your the foreman gives you, create the time card. It will keep appending each one of these days to the employee's open time card till the end of the week, where you just complete it and you post it. We also have the ability to post these timesheets directly, which we can bypass the time card altogether. That works quite well for hourly people, but if you have salary, we'd want to have those most likely on the time card to get the costing correct when the time card is posted. Expense reports. We'll have expense reports based on, we'll discuss data entry again for the expense report. We have expense types that control the posting of the costs. We have the ability to interface into accounts payable. We have company paid setup, and then we have expense reconciliation. Similar to what we looked at with the time card, we can do the same with the expense report. The project list is also restricted based on those same check boxes we talked about before, resource assignment. So we can limit somebody from charging to a specific project by limiting them through the project maintenance screen. They will also have an approver supervisor as well, and that comes from the employee and resource maintenance screen. And then we actually don't have a week ending date in here, and it's not from week maintenance. It's actually just a free-form field onto the screen. So that does not pull from week maintenance. We also have the expense type. So we'll discuss how to create an expense type, but the expense type list then drives what the GL account it posts to. And then we can also have a payment method. Here shows employee paid, but we can also have a company paid credit card set up. And the sub-account defaults based on the time and expense setup. It could pull from the employee or from the project. So let's go look at the expense types and how to set those up. Let me pull up an expense report because this will help with the So again, when I'm in expense report, I have the report date, which is freeform. I'm not restricted to any dates. The expense type, so when I F3 here and I choose, this list is available depending on how you have it set up, and this expense type list is created and maintained in expense type maintenance. Here is where I can define, again, it's a 4-digit field, alphanumeric. The description is free-form, so you can choose whatever you want here. If you want to require units, we certainly can. Most commonly, that's mileage is the one we would require units for. And then we can also put a default rate, so then your employees don't have to remember what's the current mileage rate if it changes quite frequently. We can also put in some per diem, hotel per diem rates here as well. Usually with like government contracting, the per diems are so unique based on city and things like that, it probably does not make sense to set all those up here. But you can set up a generic per diem if you desire. This GL account then becomes the ability to where it's going to post to. So if we think about what we talked about in one of the earlier sessions, this account can or has the option of being linked to an account category. So if I go back to my chart of accounts here in General Ledger, if I look at account 7,000, it's travel expense. And if I look, it has an account category. Let's see if I can get this wide enough. Has an account category of travel. So that means when I enter a line item to this account that has 7,000 referenced here, so if I put it to parking, parking will then require me to enter a project. So this is how we can control if we enter internal expenses or not. So if I choose parking, the project and the task will be required because it's linked to an account category. But if I chose a different one, I don't think any of these are not linked to an account category. Let's say tips was not linked to an account category. The project and task would be disabled, and I just enter it, and it would create an expense to my GL, but it would not create a cost on my project at that point. One of the other fields that we didn't see in the time entry is this amount paid, payment amount. So you might be a company, a lot of companies will have their employees with expense or company credit cards. And so how do you handle that? Because if it's a company credit card, we certainly don't want them entering their expense report and getting reimbursed for that, because then you're incurring that cost 2 times. So we're going to be able to restrict and allow employees to enter to their credit card too, which will help you reconcile the payment or the charges you see come to that credit card. So this gives the employee, you empower the employee to track their expenses and enter these expenses that will be coming onto the credit card. And so then once you receive the credit card, you can identify, I have a charge on my credit card that I don't have an expense for. So then you can identify, well, this might be an invalid charge on the credit card. So the value is very important that we allow the employee to be able to enter their credit card charges as well. It helps reduce the amount of confusion. Now, again, we're going to go back to a familiar screen that we've talked about before. So this screen has a lot of functionality that's available in it, and it uses it for a lot of things. So we're going to go to Code File Maintenance. And if there's a code file called TEPM, and this is where we can set up credit cards. And quite frequently I'll see set up for credit cards. So maybe you have a Kim Bateson credit card. So if I have Kim Bateson credit card here, when I'm entering my expense report, I will choose the Kim Bateson credit card from the drop down. Now the screen was not refreshed after I entered it, so that's why it's not in my list. But this list here pulls directly from this TEPM code file. If I get back there to the right spot. Guess I still have it open. I closed it. So when we're here, if it's defined in TEPM, then it's going to be available on my expense report to choose. And the system will know if they've chosen one of these travel accounts here, it will not generate an AP document for me. So it can clarify here. So if I've chosen company paid travel here, then if I put $100 on the cost, you'll notice that it puts it to the company total at the bottom of the screen. If I enter, I don't want to abandon changes. Oh, I have to have a project and a task. Now if I enter a second line to, let's say, car rental, and here I choose employee paid, and maybe that was $500. So here down below, it's tracking if an expense report is created for this, it will create a $500 AP voucher to the employee, and the $100 will not be created in a voucher, but it will be available to help you reconcile later with your credit card. We definitely want these transactions to post to accounts payable or to our financials on the general ledger side. So how do we control what those postings are? What accounts do they go to? And then how do we reconcile that once we've finished at the end of the month? So we have a setup screen where we can define if it interfaces with accounts payable or not. So this checkbox here says if I post a time card, or excuse me, expense report, that's employee related, it will generate an AP voucher. We have the ability to define a clearing account then, similar to what we saw in the time card, where if we submitted the expense report It's going to debit the cost of the employee type or expense type we set up. So that's $7,000 for the parking we saw. That's the debit portion. Then we get the credit portion, and if it's an employee paid item, it's going to go to a specific clearing account that you've defined here. If it's a company paid line item, it will flow to whatever account's defined in this screen or in this field. So typically, best practices is we would want these to be two separate accounts so that we can identify items going through AP and items that are not going through AP. We also have the ability to set up an advance, which we talked about earlier, that we can enter an expense report that's defined as advance, and this is the account it will go to when it flows to AP for that. Company paid setup, we already showed you how to find these, or how to set up these items in the code file maintenance. Now we want to talk about company paid company expense reconciliation. We mentioned that expense reports for employees always flow to AP if you've got that integrated to AP box checked. Company paid credit card or company paid expenses never flow to AP. And the reason they don't flow to AP is the idea that you want to later, you'll be getting a credit card bill from your vendor. So you really wouldn't want to have to go find a bunch of different other AP vouchers and try to connect them. So instead, you get your credit card bill from your credit card company, and then the AP clerk is going to go in and enter the credit card bill. So instead of as a voucher. And instead of when they enter the voucher entering all the expense line items on the voucher as line items, they're instead going to put it to this company clearing account. And when that AP document gets posted, the clearing account is hit. You've already got the expense from the expense reports, and then that helps you identify if there's a balance left in that clearing account, you need to review why. This company expense reconciliation can help with that. And it also can help with reconciling the items on your expense report. So if you get your statement from your credit card, you can come into this company expense reconciliation and display it for a certain set of dates, and it will show you all the items that have been entered by the employees onto that expense report. And then you can select them and say reconciled yes. And once you save them, they obviously won't show on this list, but you can always re-display this as reconciled items or unreconciled items. So if you have items that are left over that do not show on your company credit card, you know they may be coming later, or maybe the employee made an error when they entered that. So you can go back and review in more detail to see why that occurred. You can also see if there's a charge to your credit card that's not on this list. You can see if that was really a valid charge or not, or why it's on your statement. We want to come through and we talk about this time and expense setup and a few of the fields. We've hit on some of them as we've talked through features, but we're going to review them in more detail. There's so many different things related to setup on the time and expense. I wanted to kind of group them to give you a visual as to what belongs with what. So if the items in the blue box affect time entry and posting. So at the time you're entering your time card, these boxes affect how it looks and feels for the end user, specifically, or how it posts. So we can determine the first day of the week. So this works hand in hand with the week ending date. So typically, if let's say your week ending date is on a Saturday or Sunday, then your first day of the week needs to be Saturday. So the week ending dates that you would put in week maintenance would all be week ending dates that were Sunday. And then by setting up the first day of the week as Saturday in your time and expense setup, when the time card posts, it knows how to accomplish those dates that I talked about earlier. So if you have it's just very important that these are coordinated correctly. The first day of the week and your week ending dates coordinate correctly. We can post timesheets directly. I mentioned when you're entering that laundry list of employees by the foreman collected, we can bypass a time card if we want to, and it'll create a timesheet that posts automatically. If you're entering time on your time card and it's a short week, we typically wouldn't want to see, if it's a short week that ends on Tuesday, we wouldn't want to allow somebody to enter time on Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. So we're just disabling those days. So all this is just related to how it looks and feels. Probably the main one, the two main ones are the first day of the week and then this posting options here. So if you enter a time card and you choose that it posts daily, then if I have 7 days worth of time on one line item, this is easier to see in the screen. If I have a line item, actually I'll pull one up here. So you can see I've entered one line that applies to this project and task, but yet it has 5 days of time entered. So when this time card posts, do I want to get 5 line items, like one day for 8 hours, another day for 8 hours, another day for 8 hours? So if I choose to post daily, I would get 5. This would split out into 8 or 5 different days or 5 different specific lines when this time card posts. If I chose to post weekly, I would not get 5 lines. Instead, I would get 1 line for 40 hours as opposed to 5 lines for 8 hours each. This specifically is related to how you need to track your billing. So if your invoice needs the detail, then you certainly need to have it choose daily. If your invoice needs to show 1 line item, then you may want to just choose to post weekly. So that's the difference between this setup here. If I choose daily, it's going to split out into multiple days when the time card is posted. If I choose weekly, it's going to be 1 line per project, per task, per week. We also have some things related to fringe posting, which we won't cover today. I keep mentioning that we can default the account, the sub-account, and the company. So when you're entering your time card, which sub-account shows on the time card. So that's the importance of this checkbox here, is if we choose from project, then it will pull the sub-account from the project as well as the company, or if we choose employee, it will pull from the employee. Here's the overtime components. This is where we can define if we have a overtime 1 or 2 multiplier, time and a half, or double time. So you can set up to 2 of those. We can also set up specific accounts to post overtime to as well. So if we have unique overtime accounts in the general ledger, we can accommodate that. We can also separate out the premium portion. If your rate is $10 an hour and you get paid time and a half, then the overtime rate's $15 an hour. In the instance of that, generally we would post the entire $15 an hour to the same account. But if for some reason you can't build a premium component, we could have that separate the portion of the premium, so it would actually post that time as $10 and $5 separately, so then you can control the billing of that. So it would just allow you to split out the premium component. The expense setup, we've touched on these a little bit. The other component, similar to time cards, we can choose which sub-account posts on the expense report. So it could come from the project or the employee, helping with costing purposes. The approval setup tab is related to the who is going to show as the approver on a time card. So if I come over here and I look at my time card, this box here that shows approver, how is that determined? And that's set up based on this setup box here. So I can say the default approver is either the supervisor, also in here is the manager as a drop down, or we could choose another and hard code one approver across all the company. We have that same feature for expenses reports as well, so we can have a different set of approvers for expense report documents. A lot of times, time cards need to be approved by their supervisor, but maybe expense reports need to be approved by an accounting staff, the AP clerk or someone like that. We can also offer them the ability to change the approver. I don't recommend that. Then they have their neighbor approving their time cards and expense reports, and probably is not advisable. This is where we set up the project manager line item review. So if we recall, I said that you can have your project managers review the line items before the supervisors review the documents. This is where we turn that feature on. Then when the time, there's one additional setup feature required here. If I go to project maintenance, if I want this specific project to have line item review, then I come into the project and I go to the additional info tab and I can change this to required. If this is set to required, then that means the project managers review the line items before the supervisors review the document. This Flex Time Setup tab controls a lot of the look and feel that we saw in the web app. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but basically it can be web enabled, which means you can use the web apps. There's more setup besides this for getting web apps to work, but this is one component of it. Then we can show or disable a lot of these other fields so that we can either allow entry by the employee or prevent entry by the employee. Specifically, we had mentioned the labor class, the GL account, the GL sub-account. Maybe we want to allow them to see it, but we don't want them to touch it. We want to have control over what account it posts to in GL. So this tab controls all that look and feel, and so this is a place where you can kind of tailor those that to your specifications for your company. This section is to review inquiries and reporting related to time cards, specifically the Timecard Status screen, some of the reports that are available, as well as quick queries. Timecard Status screen is probably one of the main screens that we will use to identify and understand how if our time cards have been submitted by our employees or ones that we need to follow up on. You can see by this screen that we can choose by a supervisor, or manager, or specific GL sub-account. And then this 1, 2, 3, 4, the weeks here pulls directly from week maintenance. So back to the week maintenance setup screen that we were looking at earlier, this labor period and the time card period is what controls that. So the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all of them that are in period 6 here will show on this screen together. We also can identify, you'll see there's a legend in the bottom, so it'll show if it's missing, in process, rejected, so forth, or has been posted. We also have the ability to print or print preview from this screen. So whatever's on this screen, we can generate on a report as well. And if it's been approved, we can also process alerts. So the idea behind this one is that get to the right module, time and expense, Timecard Status. So I can get to the approval screen from here where I can post them, or I can do process alerts. If you have communicator and alerts set up, I can send out a bulk alert to all the employees, or I could send an alert to a supervisor if the time card is not posted or if it needs approval, things like that. So there are some functionality and features available within the Timecard Status screen. Some main reports that we would use would be the time card report, the travel and expense report, and the GL labor reconciliation report. So let's just take a minute to look at the time card report. This is the most comprehensive report we have. related to the line items on a time card. And we can use filters on this report to narrow. So we would typically run this report for a week ending date. Usually when you're looking for your time cards, you're attempting to identify, okay, are there time cards that are still in process, or are there time cards that are posted to a certain project? So we would want to restrict this report results to a specific time period or maybe even an employee. So if we look at this report, we can see that it's by employee, by period. So we'll have the document number. We can see the day of the week that was entered and the number of hours that was entered for that employee. We can jump to a specific employee. This has most of the information that's on the time card as well. We have a comparable report to this for the expense, travel and expense report. Same concept. It will have all the expense line items that we would see on a report for a given expense report. So we can see what project it was charged to and the date, and then the rate or hours, and then the total amount of that expense report. The GL labor reconciliation report is also one that, especially if you're generating transactions to GL through the GL labor posting, this report can help you identify if there are, I haven't posted any of mine, so that's why nothing's coming in, but it'll list the batch number in GL that's been posted to. It'll list the employee and their name, the project task they charged to, as well as the GL amount that it created. So this is one that you can use to compare your financials in GL and see the details of where it came from. We have some quick queries available to us. One of the features that we can use is called the Time and Expense Detailed Audit Trail. So if you enter a time card, and this is helpful if you're using for government reporting such as DCAA. We want to keep an audit trail of when the time was changed, when it was put in process, when it was completed, if it was rejected, the dates and times for those things. So if we need that type of level of detail, we have a checkbox available to us in the time and expense setup. It's called Detail Audit Report. If that checkbox is activated, then we have a quick query that we can run for both the expense reports. You'll see there's one called Expense Audit Trail and Time Audit Trail. And this would give us that level of detail. We also can see, more frequently, we would also want to see expense report line items and time card line items. So if I come over here and I do my quick query and I look at time card lines, this is frequently information that we want to and need to see. So I can see the total hours from my time card, the projects that it was charged to, and if it's costing on entry, I'll also see the amounts that are generated for those time cards. This is a great way to see what projects your employees have charged to and when and how much time they've charged to them. You can filter by the employee, by the date, by the project, or by the task as well. We have the same type of report for the expense lines. So if I come here, expense report, similar thing, I can see all the charges to the expense reports and the types. Things we've learned in this module, we've seen the big picture overview and workflow. We've learned how web apps work. We can identify now where the data comes from on our time cards and our expense reports, as well as how to set up a new employee and the employee position rate maintenance, as well as entering our time sheets and time cards, our expense reports, and key information on time card setup. This concludes Module 3, Time and Expense. In our next module, we'll cover Allocator in Module 4.